Good morning. Welcome to Alberta's Energy Future. This is the third session in the Emissions Reduction Alberta Spark Speaker Series, presented in partnership with the University of Calgary. I'm Steve McDonald, CEO of Emissions Reduction Alberta.
Good morning. I'm Marcia Nelson, Executive Fellow with the Hackett School of Business and the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. This is our third and final conversation in this series focused on the long-term sustainability of our energy future. Last week, our panel talked about the technology opportunities that will help enable economic recovery and some of the longer-term innovations that will keep us on track to meet our 2050 goals. We heard about how playing to Alberta's strengths can support incremental change in current operations, like lowering the carbon footprint of Alberta's oil sands, or how radical change can help us meet longer-term decarbonization goals, like advancing a hydrogen economy. We've talked about the opportunity around CCUS technologies and the potential of new biofuels for the aviation sector. And we heard experts talking about the importance of working with Indigenous peoples to create economic development and long-term lasting value.
Today's panel will focus on some of the drivers beyond technology that will play a role in the success of Alberta's energy future. For example, last week's panel and many of the breakout conversations touched on the need for policy innovation, the opportunity for governments to incent actions that would better position Alberta for a more resilient recovery. And we were reminded that innovative financing solutions, new business models, and even more creative communication strategies would also be critical to future success. As we explore these and other beyond technology opportunities, we also want to hear your thoughts and ideas. The input you share through the breakout sessions immediately following today's panel Q&As is incredibly valuable, and we will produce a What We Heard report that highlights the new ideas and insights you have offered. Before we introduce our panel, on behalf of Emissions Reduction Alberta and the University of Calgary's Haskayne School of Business and School of Public Policy, we thank you again for your participation in these sessions. Marcia and I also want to thank the outstanding team who worked so hard behind the scenes to develop and deliver such a quality event. We hope you are inspired to host further conversations, share new knowledge with colleagues, network with stakeholders you may not have considered previously, and help tell the story of Alberta's ambitions and successes.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts. Today we're joined by Jonathan Hackett, Jennifer Winter, Assistant Professor and Scientific Director, Energy and Environment Policy Research Division in the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, David James, the Associate Deputy Minister of Natural Gas at the Government of Alberta, and our moderator, Chad Park, Vice President of Sustainability and Citizenship at the Cooperators and Founding Director of the Energy Futures Lab. Welcome, panelists, and we're really looking forward to this discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marcia and Steve. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And it's a pleasure to be here with this great panel. Actually, before I get started, I don't know if it was true for everyone, but for me, Jonathan, the video cut out when your title was being said. So why don't you just share your title just so everyone knows who you are as well.
So sure. So I lead sustainable finance at the Bank of Montreal. So my team has an investing arm and a banking arm, and we support anything that drives sustainability in the economy. Okay.
Thank you, Jonathan. You've heard that this is the panel on beyond technology factors. The previous panel dove into some of the technology opportunities, and I'm going to give each panelist a chance to first help us get started by weighing in on what they think beyond technology means, or what it means for them. Maybe even what's one key enabling lever that's beyond technology. And that will also give them a chance to get their voice into the room and say a little bit about their background. So maybe I'll start with you, Jennifer, if you don't mind. Would you go first on that one?
Sure. So I think when I think beyond technology, it was like we really want to think about the policy environment and the role of government in creating like a business environment and an economic environment that enables technology from the very start of innovation all the way to commercialization. And throughout that technology development path, there are different types of, to be a little bit wonkish, market failures that we care about, where the goals of private actors are not aligned with the overall goals of society. And so it's, when we're thinking about beyond technology and what's the role of government, it's creating the environment for alignment of those goals. And so, on one side, something like a carbon tax, it aligns the incentive to reduce emissions with our desire to have a clean environment, for example. But on the other side of technology development, there are lots of ways where firms struggle with access to capital, firms struggle with say fitting their widget or their innovation into the regulatory environment. And that's also a place where government may need to step in and sort of smooth the path for innovators.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jennifer. You've jumped right in talking about carbon tax in the first remarks. That's great. And of course, you've referred to policy and to the role of government. And so with that in mind, I'm just going to turn to David to give his kind of opening reflections on beyond technology.
Yeah, thanks, Chad, and thanks, Jennifer, as well for that. When I think about beyond technology, I think I agree with where Jennifer was going. At the end of the day, government has a critical role in terms of creating a policy environment that allows industry to go off and do what industry does best. They're the innovators. They're the ones that can deploy capital. They're the ones that have the ability to, create the kind of economic opportunities that come. But I think government has a fundamental role, and in fact, public policy staff are uniquely situated to be able to give advice to government and to be able to bring forward to government the kind of environment or policies that allow that environment that Jennifer spoke about. So I think that our ability to convene, our ability to dialogue, our ability to look at all of the various facets that Jennifer spoke about, the competing interests that exist within industry, the competing interests that exist within the general environment, the economy, and what have you. I think that's a fundamental place where beyond technology needs to exist. And if we get that right, then innovators and entrepreneurs and companies can start to deploy capital. They can start to deploy technology. Now, that said, there's also potentially a path for government to not just create the policy environment, but sometimes to drive those particular outcomes. So past investment in CCUS, for example, and now we've got the Alberta trunk line, we've got Quest, we've got some of those opportunities to leverage those technologies. So I think there's both a pathway for policy, and then there's a pathway for government to set programs, but also to create the conditions where innovation can flourish. So Alberta Innovates, for example, ERA, some of those various aspects are, I think, just indicative of where government can deploy its resources and put policies and programs in place that can help advance technology, but it's the beyond technology aspect of it. So maybe I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll get into more.
Thanks, David. That's great. And Jonathan, both Jennifer and David have already mentioned the word investment. I imagine that's part of the perspective you're bringing, but go ahead and give your opening remarks as well on beyond technology factors.
Yeah, I think it's very much, as David and Jennifer mentioned, this question of how do we create the environment in which industry can pursue things rationally, where we can actually say, okay, these investments will actually translate into the right returns. And I think within that, there are two primary things that I think about. One is the stability and predictability. So the ability to say, I know the environment that I'm putting my money into and how that environment is going to return back that capital to me with the hurdle that I need it to hit. And that's one where having a policy landscape that is not just well-defined, but also is relatively stable is absolutely integral. And the other, I think, is on the structuring side of finance. And that's where I spend a lot of time thinking about how do we take some of those risks or some of those kind of time issues that are unmitigable. So one example being that early players in a space tend not to have the efficiencies of later players in the space. And that's just a reality that we're always going to face, that early market access on a commoditized solution, like carbon, where in the end, it's not that you're removing the first ton of carbon is better than removing the last ton of carbon, that there's a disincentive for early action. And so whatever ways we can, whether it's through bundling, whether it's through incentivization programs that you can take advantage of by getting there earlier, whatever way we can create a landscape that overcomes that kind of structural issue through financing, through policy, is another big unlock that I can see the kind of beyond technology area as being.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Now, you've all kind of alluded to this, and David mentioned it explicitly, the fact that there are competing interests at play in this system that we're trying to advance. And so, when we're talking about any of these levers we've been just mentioning here, we're talking about enabling, so levers that help enable a certain outcome. But with competing interests, there's lots of different outcomes that might be at play. So I guess I'm interested in having each of you or any of you weigh in on how do we, in this system we're working in, how do we best align those interests, or what are the levers that are maybe best well suited to be able to foster greater alignment among those interests? And Jennifer, you kind of alluded to that at the start, but I give each of you a chance to weigh in on that dynamic.
That's a great question. I'll just go first. Why not?
Sure.
It really is a great question. And there are always going to be competing interests. And I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't acknowledge that. And, the role of a government is to decide on what outcome we want as a society. I mean, that's sort of it. And it's a values-based judgment, right? It's weighing all of these competing factors. Policy decisions are going to have winners and losers. And I think we need to acknowledge this up front. And so, yes, the role of government is to decide on an outcome that they hope best reflects the best outcomes for society. And if we as voters don't like that, then we have a chance every 4 years to change the direction of policy. And I realize that is very much sort of an academic rose-colored glasses view of policy, but that's to start with. Yes, it's a values-based decision, and governments make trade-offs every day, and it's really important to acknowledge it.
Okay.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll jump on, not to keep going in the same sequence. I'm sure we'll change it eventually here. But so I think that's a really great perspective, Jennifer. And, having worked in public policy now, one of the most significant challenges I've seen over time is how do you balance competing interests, and how do you create an environment that allows for that? That you're never going to overcome, as you said, all the conflicting interests that exist out there. But one of the things I think government has an opportunity to do is, and I talked a little bit about a convening role, right? Being the one that brings people together, so that as government is making those trade-off decisions, they have a sort of a fulsome view of what are the perspectives and what are the competing interests. And I think that, coming to Jonathan's point earlier, that stable policy environment, if governments aren't appropriately bringing together and understanding the various interests that are out there and trying to create policy decisions, which are trade-offs and which are choices that have to be made, and they do fundamentally come down to where do we think the economy needs to go, where do we think a particular aspect of the economy needs to go. If we don't get those trade-offs quite right, they can be a little bit imbalanced, but the stability that Jonathan spoke about starts to really degrade if you've got those fundamentally shifted. And I've always used a pendulum kind of example. So if the pendulum goes too far to the right or to the left, and not political spectrum, literally physically right or left on a pendulum, then what you end up getting is you will get a rebalancing over time. And good public policy contemplates that sort of scale of, incline away from the sort of the upright, right? And if you push it too far, when it rebounds, your stability goes all out of whack. So you can have some perturbations in the middle, but you kind of want to try to balance that. It's a tough job, but I think you're right. It's a challenge.
Jonathan, can you elaborate a bit on that point about stability and predictability, especially from an investor perspective, why it's so important?
Yeah, and I'm going to use an example that, David, please don't take as too pointed straight at you, but natural gas is probably the easiest place to really talk about a trade-off on investment, where if you believe that there's going to be a net zero natural gas future, where the infrastructure that we use today for methane is used either for renewable methane or for hydrogen in with some retrofitting, that it makes sense to invest behind that and to say, okay, let's invest on getting the emissions down faster. Let's have the technologies. Let's have all of those pieces in place. And there are parts of the world where the standpoint that they're taking is that that's not part of their vision of a post-2050 reality. And instead, they need to massively ramp up renewable power production to offset the fact that, if you look at certain areas, everyone's home heating, everyone's water heating, all of these, massive energy sources are actually sinks are being provided for by natural gas, and that in the absence of a clear renewable natural gas or net zero natural gas future, there's a massive investment profile sitting there that you need to meet. And so having clarity on the environment you're going to be in, and I know it's Jennifer, to your point, impossible to say this policy reality is going to persist for the next 30 years. But I think, David, echoing what you've said, if you strike that balance, if you've engaged stakeholders well, and if you've taken the temperature, finding certain stable points that can survive transitions of government over time and over decades, it allows a much more efficient investment thesis, which for investors and for the financial sector means lower risk, greater returns as a result. And on the other side, if you kind of view it on the collective efforts of humanity, means a lot less wasted effort. If we spend a whole bunch of effort on, renewable natural gas for the next 15 years, and then somebody decides that that's no longer the right answer, and we instead spend billions of dollars ripping out pipes all the way into people's homes and replacing it with new technology and replacing every, piece of infrastructure that today survives on natural gas, that's a massive investment that if you wanted to do it as a stimulus project now, it's better to do it now than to do it in 20 years. But either way, making a large turn on that would be a huge waste of money and a huge destruction of value from a financial market perspective.
Yeah, so maybe if I could jump off of that, because what that sort of talks to me a little bit about is how do you create an enabling policy environment, right? Government is not, and in fact, I would say if you go back historically through governments have picked more losers than winners, but government is not good at knowing the future, right? I don't think any industry is good at knowing the future. So when government makes a policy choice, one of the best things government can do is make sure that the enabling sort of factors and facilitate some of the different pathways. So yes, you need to have a sense of what the future is, but any deviation to the right or to the left of that future can create an entirely different outcome. And so how do we as government, or how does government, I'm not government per se, but how does government look at those options and make sure that directionally they're going the right way, directionally people can move, they can make those investments, they can make those determinations, that you're not stranding a lot of that investment into the future, but that it leaves room for people to deviate and bring those innovations into the space that will change what the potential is in the future. So I think that's a real challenge that I've seen over the years for government. It's hard to align all the interests when you do that. But because you give some breadth, you also have the ability to give some space for various competing interests to see where those interests can actually achieve outcomes in the future.
So I just want to sort of dig a little deeper here and just put on the table maybe an elephant in the room that I'm not sure there has been a more divergent and polarized set of issues recently in Canada than climate and energy issues. Maybe there are, but and so I feel like what we're talking about so far is the ideal, and what we should strive for. And then the reality is that we've had a lot of difficulty achieving that recently in terms of things like avoiding the pendulum swings in policy, or things like aligning interests among different stakeholders and so on. And I know there's a lot at play there. There's, of course, politics. There's, you know, dramatic changes in economy and technology that's driving a lot of that and so on. But let's kind of ground the big picture there and the ideal into the reality of where we are right now. So just dig a little deeper. And Jennifer, do you have any reflections on, in the current situation, how we can try to achieve this ideal a little better than we have so far?
Sure. So I think part of the, you know, I don't even want to call it a problem. I would say part of the difference of opinion is really just differences in what the future looks like, and in sort of the vision of the future. And both Jonathan and Dave have alluded to this, right? And that vision of the future is it's values based. And I think it's also caught up in the, call it like the energy endowment of different provinces, right? You can think of provinces like BC, Manitoba, Quebec that have massive hydro resources. And so electrification in many ways is very easy for them. And it's the other sources of emissions that are harder to deal with, like in the transportation sector. Whereas, say, in Alberta, Saskatchewan, you know, where we have abundant fossil fuel resources, you know, there's a reason we develop them, because they're cheap, effective sources of energy. And, you know, that's what we're used to frames how we view the future. And I'll just make one last point that, you know, one of my pet peeves is the discussion of like a low carbon transition or a low carbon energy future. And it ignores the 20 some specified gases that are also a problem, and focusing on one. And I just, you know, I really want the conversation to be about lowering emissions, which are the problem, not just eliminating use of, say, fossil fuels or one source of energy.
Okay, I'm going to go to Jonathan and David in a second about that point about different visions of the future. But the point about low carbon versus low emissions, it kind of raises these issues of language and the importance of the language we use. And another term I've heard, and frankly I've used a lot in my work, is transition. But I also know that transition is a word that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and can even sometimes be polarizing. So, or at least cause some reactions. So Jennifer, do you want to say a little bit more about the language we use and sort of either opportunities or flags, you know, in how we try to align interests?
That's, again, a really great point, in that I think we are using language differently, in that, like, you know, many people use low carbon when they mean low emissions, or it's energy transition when, you know, they're talking about, you know, on the one hand, total elimination of fossil fuels and 100% renewables. Others of us have a different interpretation, and that can really make it difficult to have a meaningful conversation about what the future looks like if we don't have, you know, the same, I mean, we're using the same vocabulary, but we don't have the same meaning behind them. And it's also, I think it's our tendency to be sloppy about our language and make inferences about what the other person is saying based on our own interpretation of language. Mm. And that is likely one of the contributing factors to, say, the dissonance between visions of the future across Canada. Okay,
thank you. And I'll say from my work with the Energy Futures Lab that what you're getting at there is one of the reasons why, when we talk about beyond technology, we also need to, I think, look beyond even just policy and finance and so on, but also into the realm of culture, because culture and everything that's implied there around narratives, you know, the way we talk about it, the way we engage with one another about these issues, there's all kinds of opportunity there for creativity and engagement of other voices than typically are part of these conversations. And that might help us find some greater alignment on vision. But let's go give David and James a chance to weigh. David and Jonathan a chance to weigh in on the alignment and future vision point. And maybe I'll just put an extra spin on it, which is, has COVID-19 changed, from your perspective, or the kind of stakeholders you deal with, changed any sense of what the goals are or the vision is, or maybe the timelines around those goals?
Yeah, I'll just, so we do change the order, I'll hop in. I think, you know, the COVID, you know, pandemic, combined with the, you know, simultaneous impacts on the energy sector, has really brought to the forefront a lot of questions around how we invest. And I think, as David was saying, you know, where government can try and create a neutral ground, there's also the, particularly when it comes to stimulus, this opposite statement of, like, government can choose winners in this moment. You know, if you're going to deploy massive piles of capital in order to try to, you know, keep an economy moving, the question of, you know, in the US parlance, a Green New Deal, or, you know, I think some of the other terms being used, the Building Back Better hypothesis, really bring this idea of, can you target kind of getting a 2-for-1 on stimulus funding? And I think, you know, moving aside from whether or not that's how that's going to happen, or whether it's going to happen in different jurisdictions, I think a lot of companies are looking at the same concept of building back better, of saying, okay, when we're changing our, you know, our footprint, physical footprint, you know, that's going to have environmental impact as well. If I can get the same deal done without flying 10 people across the country to go meet with a client, that's, you know, better for my bottom line. It's also better for my environmental impact. And that's something where we can really, you know, get a benefit while addressing a fundamental problem. I think it's opening people's perspective into, you know, is this something that we can address through multiple approaches? And is there something we can do at the same time as we try to solve these problems to build, I think, that common word that I feel like I use more and more often between both COVID and energy, which is resilience. The idea of, you know, we shouldn't be building fragile systems if we have an ability to build something that we can withstand the shocks and pressures, whether it be an oil price change, whether it be, you know, because most of our carbon reduction efforts were really dependent upon free-flowing capital from energy companies that were willing to say, this is something I can also put my money behind. And if that disappears, we don't have a resilient infrastructure for carbon capture, as an example. But also on the other side, with human capital and how we can make our approach there more resilient.
Okay, well, maybe resilience is the great aligning concept that we can all rally behind. David, any reflections on vision and timelines and so on?
Yeah, maybe a couple to bring a couple thoughts together. So in terms of vision, let me speak to COVID first. I think the challenge that governments have now is what is the most important outcome, right? 6 months ago, the government of Alberta, for example, and in Canada, they had very clear outcomes. They had very clear pathways. They had very clear plans. The COVID situation has kind of thrown all those up into the air, and they're trying to figure out now what that next stage looks like. And candidly, I think it's, how do we just keep our economy working so that we have people who have jobs and we have the ability for our economy to work? And how do we position ourselves now so that we have the human capital and the ability for people to invest into the future as we come through this time, right? And I think that's broader than just the oil and gas sector. I think that's manufacturing sectors. I think that's finance sectors. I think that's aviation. That's all of those. Coming to sort of the energy side of it, and maybe this, you know, build back better. So we've been having lots of conversations about what a vision for natural gas looks like. And to come back to Jonathan's comment earlier, is how do we situate ourselves in a way that, as you come through the COVID crisis, are there recovery opportunities that we can take advantage of. And you've seen yesterday the Premier came out with Alberta's recovery strategy or plan. And in there, he speaks about things like the hydrogen economy and the opportunity for the hydrogen economy. And in fact, he was speaking at a business council between Canada and the UAE yesterday, identifying that we have an opportunity to invest into a hydrogen economy to support a transition to a cleaner future, right? We realize that energy will transition over time. Some of that will be industry driven, some of that will be economy driven, some of that will be policy driven. And all of those policies will vary at a provincial, municipal, federal level. But I think what we need to make sure that we do as we come through the COVID situation is we have the opportunity to envision a future that has people back to work, has economy firing again. And as we do that, how do we make sure that that economy has the opportunity to take advantage of smart investments in things like pipelines that support hydrogen, for example, or facilities that support that net zero future that allows for different paths, again, slightly divergent, not sure exactly the path, but sort of set those conditions. So I think the language that Jennifer spoke about and you spoke about, Chad, absolutely challenging. And maybe this is where the convening piece comes in. The ability to convene helps us understand perspectives. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to find equanimity in all of the options, right? It just helps us to understand what those options are and what those perspectives are. And then when government's making a decision, they're making an informed decision about what that future path looks like. And they're not just trading off to create balance. They're trading off to say, no, this is the path. This is the direction we're going to go. And I realize that in going that direction, this other thing is not going to be what's going to happen. And I think that's some of what we see. And the transition language does make that a little challenging because I know the federal and provincial government have different views perhaps of what that looks like, as well as different parts of the economy. Maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, we're going to turn to the question and answer now. So a few people have already inputted some questions, and I'll just encourage others to do so now in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. I think I'm going to, I notice in the questions already there are several that are about role of government. So we'll get to those in a moment, but your remarks just now, David, kind of lead beautifully into this first question. So I'll just read it. It's a little bit long, but I think it's really on point here. It says, let's work off the premise that for a moment that it's not about balance. It's not actually about trade-offs, because while there are competing interests, they are not equal. They do not equally benefit. They do not equally harm. They do not require equal or equitable attention. To say otherwise is more a speaking point than a strategy. So the question, when does balancing competing interests serve no one well, I guess? And what is an alternative way forward beyond convening? This is, I guess, getting back to the point about how we manage competing interests and so on.
So maybe really quickly, just to jump off what I said a few minutes ago, I think when it doesn't serve us well is when government creates so broad a watershed of pathways that nobody can see what the future is. Capital can't be invested well. You can't actually get towards outcomes of the future. And so, government's choices are always challenging, and it's not about equanimity. It's not about balance necessarily. Sometimes governments need to make the very hard decisions to say this, not that. And candidly, I think we've seen that in terms of the very polarized views over time, right? You get people pathways, a particular pathway that drives to an outcome that the particular government or has identified as important, and sometimes that then creates a view on the other side of that to say I'm now a loser and I'm going to go hard at sort of advocating for my position, and you get that sort of competing polarized view every few years in the environment, and that's entirely appropriate in a democracy like we have. I think that's some of the challenges governments face.
Jennifer, did you want to elaborate on that one?
Yes.
I thought you might.
So it's important for government to hear from different affected parties, but that doesn't mean that policy has to reflect the interests of the different affected parties. And I think it's incumbent on governments to take both like a longer and a wider view. Politicians are responsible to voters. Firms are responsible to their shareholders, but the public service and the government is what provides transition and continuity in the actions of government. And I think we can point to lots of actions where the public and the voters and private sector are rather unhappy with the actions of government, but the choice was for a better society. I mean, just think like somewhat of a spurious example, just taxes. No one likes taxes, right? But it provides public services like education and healthcare that we value. And so this is where a government is making a policy decision that is painful for voters in the private sector in order to create an enabling structure. And so I think it's important to remember that, yeah, it's not just about trade-offs, and sometimes it's perfectly okay for the government to ignore like lobbyists, for lack of a better word.
Okay. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative and just offer a quick thought myself on this one. In the Energy Futures Lab, we sometimes talked about the fact that it's there's a difference between consultation and even negotiation versus co-creation. And I'll say what I mean there. People from various backgrounds come together are often more familiar with doing so in the context of consultation. So being asked what your point of view is on a certain thing. And that, of course, is necessary in all for all the reasons we alluded to here. But in a highly polarized environment with divergent views about the future and so on, consultations are quite unlikely to change anyone's point of view. In fact, they'll often reinforce points of view because you're being asked to come and share your point of view. So you're gonna stand by your point of view. And same when you're negotiating based on how to achieve your own interests. So if we're in an environment that requires some degree of finding common ground and so on, my offering there is to try to seek ways that we can actually get people doing things together. It's the collaborative, co-creative kind of space that stands a chance of people finding some common ground. So that'd be my one little addition to that answer. There's some questions here about government. I'm going to turn to one where they've specifically asked you, Jonathan. And this is now getting all the way back to technology, but that's kind of the role of enabling infrastructure for technology. So the question is, can you ask the speakers to reflect on the role of government in de-risking technology? And perhaps Jonathan, his view from an investment perspective.
So government plays a large number of roles in de-risking technology today. I think the question of could they do more? Absolutely. There are infinite myriad ways in which government can get more involved, whether it's providing insurance the same way EDC does on export for, things that have technology risk associated. There are insurance companies that construct some of these things for different types of risk, but government could certainly play that role. I think where it gets messy is it is very much into choosing winners and losers at a certain point. You can't do it blindly. And so I don't know if it's always the most efficient place for government. I think the way that ERA does it is a very interesting one where you do essentially take on a step in the process, but it's not the same as providing someone relief for when they've made a choice that's gone bad, which I feel is an inefficient use of capital sometimes versus actually just trying to say, how do we catalyze more capital into this, or how do we provide incentives on the upside that, some large number of people are going to fail to develop technologies, choosing a particular step along the way to provide them with relief from a failure versus to provide rewards and to provide incentives for more capital to go in and to kind of have that risk reward trade-off pay off. It's very hard to choose where you would go in.
Okay. Now we're getting lots of questions, and I'm realizing we probably as usual, in these kind of things, we may not have time to get to them all. So I'm actually going to just pose two of them and at the same time, and then because I can see a relationship between these two, and then see who wants to weigh in there. So one says, and I think it builds from what you just said, Jonathan, sound public policy should aim for performance-based outcomes rather than mandates to avoid presupposing technology winners and losers. Freely functioning market forces should bring forward the most efficient solutions. Okay, there's no question in there, actually. That's a point of view. So it'll lead to the question, which is the next one. How can we create a system that is balanced in the face of significant power that an incumbent industry has to influence policies? So that's a bit of an elephant in the room kind of question as well. If we're talking about winners and losers, and how do we create the most kind of open, free market kind of environment for solutions? Anyone have a response there? Jonathan, go ahead.
I'll hop in with maybe a controversial response to it, which is that influence isn't just a proxy for tax revenues. It's also a proxy for economic impact, right? So when we say this is the best idea in a vacuum, we're really ignoring the fact that there are people's jobs, there are industry investments associated with there's people's livelihoods from their financial money that they put in backing firms or, backing debt to those firms all the way along. And obviously I'm biased in that my bank has debt to nearly everybody. But the reality is that when we say this is the best technology, I'm a recovering theoretical physicist. Theoretical physicists are some of the best people at assuming that there's some fundamental truth underlying everything and ignoring the reality of how things get done. And, we need things that will allow for a smooth transition with limited economic dislocation. And the trade-off of saying, look, this is the best net zero 2050 technology. And if we just could ignore the fact that we need to survive for the next 30 years, and we put all our money behind that, it's the best solution, ignores the fact that working with large stakeholders, working with large capital bases, working with, in the case of Canada, a source of revenue that could be used to fund a lot of those things without having to do it via straight taxation, by incentivizing those large corporations to come along for the ride. By working with them as partners, it's possible we can get a lot more done. And so the presumption that people are diametrically opposed to solutions is ignoring a lot of policy solutions that can align incentives towards a final outcome, and then say the technology that is the right answer is actually the one that gets the most people to the right outcome safely, healthily, happily, and without creating, the downside of any policy is the risk that there's revolution response. And if we, put everyone out of work, not just in Alberta, but across the country, by saying, good news, like we just don't use electricity anymore, that's a great solution. We could be net zero tomorrow, but it's not a great solution for every component of, society and preserving all the other things that we have with it.
Jennifer, how about you?
I'll build on that for sure.
Okay.
I think one of the other things that we tend to ignore is that when we talk about emissions reduction technologies, generally speaking, it's very expensive to develop these, especially when we're talking about emissions reduction technologies attached to, say, heavy industry. And I'm not just thinking about the oil sands or electricity generation, it's say like steel creation, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are lots of examples where we have a pretty significant emissions profile associated with just economic activity. And so one of the things we want to think about is when we're developing these really expensive types of technologies, we need to work with those incumbents that are going to use those technologies and that they are part of the solution. So, in many ways, it's providing, say, an economic incentive, like with a carbon tax or with TIER, to reduce emissions at the facility level, and also providing the economic incentive in terms of government support for innovation, because there are lots of I'll call them market failures along that innovation pathway that government has a role in supporting. And one of the most important ones is where the benefits to society are greater than the benefits to the innovator. And the capital markets are not going to provide sufficient funding for those innovations because there's that disparity between the benefits to society and the benefits to the innovator and the benefits to the capital markets. And that's a really important role for government, is recognizing that there are policy levers on both sides, like a carrot and a stick for helping us get to a better future.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of not picking winners and losers, everyone wants to talk about hydrogen these days. So let's talk a little bit. There's a question here. Someone talked about a hydrogen economy as a vision for the future. I think that was you, David. What do you think about a time frame for Alberta's transition to a hydrogen economy? And while we could all likely agree on this as a great goal, how do we help citizens understand the range of choices in the path developed by government, depending on levels of taxation, different policy levers, and so on? So I guess it's a chance to elaborate a little bit on that opportunity and how it relates to our conversation so far. You want to go with that, David?
Yeah, no, so hydrogen is an interesting one because people for years and years have been talking about the hydrogen economy. They've been talking about hydrogen deployment technology. What I find really interesting, is I've only come into it in the last several months, is what we're actually working off of government is interest from industry, right? There's a whole series of participants with industry who are actually saying, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this. Some of it is policy barriers that are in the way. So for example, the ability to put natural gas into pipelines. There's already places in the world that are using natural gas in distribution systems for home heating and taking some of that industrial heat emissions and reducing some of those emissions in industrial heating or residential heating. We in Canada and we in Alberta just need to have policies around what that looks like and making sure that when they go to do that, we understand what it means, that the safety standards are in place. So there's something as simple as that we can enable. There's other ones where we can work with industry, and this comes back to the incumbent questions when you talk about balance, right? Society is driving change, and you think about what government has done with things like the Indigenous Investment Opportunities Corporation or Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. You think about where carbon policies have gone over time. You think about where emissions policies have gone over time. So there are things that are moving forward and are requiring even those incumbent industries to make adjustments and changes over time. There's policy that's shaping some of that. So you talk about balance. In the case of hydrogen, then, is how do you work with those incumbents, because many of them are incumbents who have the ability to produce hydrogen or have the ability to move hydrogen into storage caverns or put it into distribution systems or capture the carbon that comes with it. So government needs to be able to do that. So as we build a vision out for it, we want to work with industry, we want to work with the pathways that they're already defining, including transportation pathways that are being built all over the world and are now coming to Alberta. So timelines, I think industry will allow some of those timelines to evolve. How fast it goes will really depend on who's ready to deploy the capital into that environment and whether or not there's an opportunity for economic return. If we need to then incent a particular technology or policy in that or allow that to happen, those are some of the paths that we're looking at. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are a bunch of the considerations that we're looking at as we think about it. So we don't have a time frame. But I think by 2050, the IEA would say hydrogen needs to be a significant part of that net zero pathway, along with CCS, which enables some of it.
Thanks, David. Jonathan, do you have a view on that from an investor perspective?
Yeah, I think, there's going to be a natural feedback mechanism at a certain point. We already have large numbers of investors that are signing up for commitments on their portfolio, whether it be by 2030, 2040, or 2050, and have alignment to different scenarios of, 2 degree, 1.5 degree. I've seen even some ambitious 1 degree pins at different conferences where people are essentially committing to align their investments. And I think the idea of it's not a free choice at a certain point. If we proceed along and say, okay, this jurisdiction is going to say we're going to hit a certain level of targets by 2060 or 2070, or some places are going to go well beyond. There's a natural feedback loop that'll occur with the investor community, with where capital is going, and globally in doing so, just because of the flows of capital across borders, that'll make it very hard for capital to continue supporting companies that aren't aligned. And so when governments choose different timelines in different scenarios, the piece that I think they need to kind of keep in mind is that it creates a difficulty in investment for companies that operate in jurisdictions where the financial incentives, both negative and positive, that come with incentivizing people to achieve those goals aren't there. And it could create an anti-competitive situation, or an uncompetitive situation, I should say, where the companies that operate in jurisdictions that don't have an alignment to a common trajectory just aren't operating in an arena that sets them up for success. And they might still be there on the operating costs, but suddenly the cost of capital that comes from investors just radically changes as huge swaths of the kind of warm bath of investor interest that we operate in now disappear.
Okay, I was going to ask a different question now, but since what you just said relates very well to one question in our Q&A here, so I better ask that one, and maybe Jennifer, you can weigh in on it first. The question is, what are your thoughts on the ways in which we can address the wide regional disparity in opinion and incentives on these issues?
I guess, do we need to, is my first question. But by that, I mean, it's, Canada is a fairly decentralized federation, and to what extent do we need interprovincial or provincial federal cooperation? We have differences of opinion, but I also think we, generally speaking, we are lazy thinkers, for lack of a better word, in that we've settled into, say, caricatures of the average individual or the opinions of people in other provinces. And that, I think, can create a perception that the gulf between policy and the gulf between opinion is wider than it really is. And so, I'm hand waving here because I don't really, I don't really have an answer, but I also think that discussion rather than yelling loudly about what each province wants or needs is far more constructive.
Okay, I know our experience with the Energy Futures Lab is that there is a lot of basis of alignment among seemingly very diverse interests. And sometimes it just creates the right, it's just about having the right context for those discussions and solutions. I want to ask this one last question just before we go set up for the breakout group. And it isn't actually explicitly there in the list, so sorry to you panelists, it's not one that you can have prepared for, but I think it is alluded to in that earlier question we were talking about power and incumbents. And David, you mentioned the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, so I just want to go there because I think what part of what I'm sure is under the surface of that question about power is that certain voices have not felt empowered in these discussions and in this policy making process in years past. And so I just want to give everyone an opportunity to kind of, especially in the context we're working in now, about the the heightened visibility and awareness of the implications of people not feeling empowered. And I know that's a much broader discussion than this one, but it ultimately plays itself into these kind of discussions as well, or it should. So anyone want to reflect on how we can create the right conditions for more people to be empowered in the processes of resolving all these issues?
So at the risk of hopping into a controversial question, I'll throw it there that, and at the risk of actually using one of those words that we said everyone interprets differently, the concept of a just transition and looking at what actions can be taken, it is hard. I think fundamentally it needs to be recognized that, mathematically you can only optimize a quantity at a time. It's just a mathematical fact. And we're talking about trying to solve environmental problems. We're trying to talk about solving economic problems. We're trying to talk about, I think, as you alluded to, solving economic injustice and societal injustice that's persisted for a long period of time, if not forever. And trying to solve all of those at the same time doesn't certainly make the problem easier, but it is an opportunity, because if we have something that is a call to action, if we have something that is something that necessitates policy change, reflecting on the impacts of that policy across all of the different considerations and across all of the different stakeholders opens up new opportunities. And I think, funds that bring in Indigenous groups into the building of projects, we've seen them as a very powerful tool to increase the success, like the likelihood of success, and de-risk those projects. The biggest risk to any infrastructure build or into any thing within our infrastructure business is in the societal execution and the ability to have the buy-in from stakeholders and the ability to support something that helps address an economic disparity or a societal injustice at the same time while de-risking a project. Creates a very powerful incentive model to banks and to other organizations to work with those groups and to provide the support. And so that to me seems a great example of a way of making it more successful by addressing the kind of just transition or the, how do we address those societal issues at the same time. And so I think I find a lot of hope in constructs like that, and the idea that, we can say, I'll go back on the whole mathematical piece. There are a lot of arguments in ESG about efficient frontiers. And the idea that if you are integrating ESG, you're somehow giving up on an efficient frontier. And the first 10 years of my, professional or academic life were around solving constrained problems. And the easiest thing I can say is that the efficient frontier hypothesis only works in a very simple mathematical situation that isn't reality. And so the idea that we couldn't find a better solution when looking at these things and introducing more constraints, the idea that that's a mathematical fact is wrong. There is a wide range of opportunity. The idea that there could be solutions that are just as good, if not better, that include those factors is well within the realm of what can be done.